Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today, in this segment, we are welcoming back to the show Kevin Gozstola. Kevin Gozstola is certainly no stranger to the Project Censored audience. He's been joining us, for years, actually, but especially in this past year, he's been giving us consistent updates on the case of Julian Assange. Kevin Gozstola is an independent journalist at The Dissenter. He is also the author of Guilty of Journalism, the political case against Julian Assange, with a foreword by Abby Martin. Let me give Kevin a proper introduction, even though he is no stranger to our audience. He spent the last decade reporting on Assange, Wikileaks, and the wider war on whistleblowers. He was the co-founder and managing editor over at Shadow Proof, but is an independent journalist now and curator of the Dissenter newsletter. He is also a producer of the podcast Unauthorized Disclosure, and his work has appeared in The Nation, Salon, Common Dreams, Truth Out, and many other places. Kevin Gozstola, welcome back to the Project Censored Show.
Hey, it's good to be with you again.
Kevin, there has been in the last month or two, there have been a number of updates around the Julian Assange case as he is still in Belmarsh prison. I'm speaking with you. It is Thursday, April 4th. This interview is pre-recorded. The program will air next week. But April 11 is the 5-year anniversary of Julian Assange being taken and put in Belmarsh prison. And I, again, want to reiterate to our audience, he's been, he's being detained there. He's not been sentenced. And you and I have talked about this before. So as he keeps waiting for kangaroo courts and political show trials to decide his fate, he's been languishing there. So Kevin, can you please give us some updates? There has been some action in the case and in the appeals process. Please bring us up to speed, Kevin Gozstola.
There was a major development, and it's complex. I think it was confusing for people who are not following the case as closely as me, because it was kind of reported as Julian Assange was granted an appeal. And then it was also reported that it was on hold, or there's something the US government's going to do. And so Julian Assange isn't really going to be able to challenge his extradition. And the fight has basically been lost. It's a bit of both. But what I would report to people as we update your listeners is that the UK Appeals Court, this High Court of Justice, ruled after a little more than a month. I thought that was remarkable because limbo has defined a lot of this case, and we've seen that the courts will take lots and lots of time in making decisions. And the people who are strongly suspicious of what the US government is doing to Assange, rightly so, think that this limbo is intentional and they're dragging it out, and they really would prefer not to put Julian Assange on trial, maybe just see him die in prison. And so they're punishing him through this process. But the court issued a decision, and there were 9 grounds for appeal that his legal team had presented. Only on 2.5 of the grounds for appeal did the court say those were valid. And you may say, why 2.5? How do they do that? Well, the issue of is his right to freedom of expression being violated was one in which the court said, no, we don't think what he was doing was journalism. We don't think that the U.S. can't extradite him and put him on trial because it would violate his rights in that respect. However, lead prosecutor in this case, his name is Gordon Kromberg, said to us in a filing, or said to the district court when she reviewed the extradition request, that Julian Assange, if he were on trial, could argue that he was protected by the First Amendment, and then prosecutors would just go to the judge and say, well, he's a foreigner, he's not from the US, so he has no First Amendment rights. And that was what they could argue. And that set off alarm bells for the high court justices, because they really were afraid that Julian Assange's, I guess, freedom of speech or certain constitutional rights that typically come with defendants in the past that he would be deprived of those rights while he is on trial. The second thing of importance was that they didn't like how the attorneys answered their questions when they were asked about the death penalty and whether Julian Assange would face the risk of a death sentence if he was brought to the United States. Now, just to be clear, he's charged with 17 counts of violating the Espionage Act, and he's charged with 1 count of a conspiracy to commit a computer intrusion. None of those offenses carry the death sentence. But how will we get to there? Well, the attorneys didn't say that the answer was no when they were asked if additional charges could be added to the indictment after Julian Assange was extradited to the US. So the fear is that, given what we have heard from officials in the past, that they might say you aided and abetted treason. Well, the crime of treason can carry a death penalty. What if they say that he engaged in espionage, actual classic form of espionage, not this form that we've seen popularized of like leaking classified information to the press? I mean, what if they say Julian Assange was working for a foreign power like Russia and they want to add an espionage charge to the case? Those are both crimes that can carry the potential of a death penalty. It is barred by extradition law in the United Kingdom to extradite someone to a country where they would face a death sentence. So this is where he was granted the possibility of an appeal hearing.
So, Kevin, this goes back to, again, you can follow Kevin Gozstola's work at thedissenter.org. You wrote March 28th, UK High Court extradition removes CIA's rationale for assassinating Assange. And that is where you wrote more about the High Court's decision. Couple things obviously coming out of that. One, we want to revisit the CIA momentarily, just for a reminder of what that was about. But also the other issue here about the death penalty, again, does it not, again, what, just your opinion, what is the likelihood that if Assange was extradited, if he is sent to the United States, I fail to understand how it's possible for him to receive a fair trial. So I know that this would be speculation, but you are very well educated and informed about this case and around this issue. Obviously, you wrote the book on it, Guilty of Journalism, the political case against Julian Assange. What are your thoughts about that process and what could happen? I don't believe he could receive a fair trial.
Yeah, the argument from Julian Assange's attorneys is, if you look at this district where he will be put on trial, the Eastern District of Virginia, not only do you have judges that are part of what has been dubbed the espionage court, they're highly inclined to favor the national security arguments of prosecutors, but you also have the fact that this jury pool, the people who could be populated, who will be invited or asked to perform their duty as jurors if Julian Assange decides to have a jury trial, they will come from a population that are government employees or contractors of, let's just call it top secret America, as Bill Arkin and Dana Priest dubbed it over 15 years ago. That these people they've gone through training. Some of them, if they should be asked if they have a security clearance, because if they do, they've gone through training where they have probably seen pictures of Julian Assange or Chelsea Manning or Edward Snowden or Thomas Drake, who was an NSA whistleblower, who've been held up as insider threats, and they're told how to safeguard classified information, and that if certain state secrets are disclosed, there's going to be pandemonium and all sorts of chaos and danger for the United States. So how would you think they would feel if they are asked to review these allegations against Julian Assange? I mean, even though they're new and he has occupied a role as a publisher, the US government has gone above and beyond to make it so that he seems like he's not a journalist, and in fact is more of a nefarious actor, a malicious actor, so to speak. And so I just want to, so that answers your question, but I want to make sure that I don't forget to get in here that with the High Court's ruling, this appeals court, what I told you was the good news, that he was giving given an opportunity for an appeal, but that was put on hold because in a paragraph, very clearly, they told the US government what magic words the US government needs to say in order to avoid an appeal. And it was right there on a silver platter. It just says, tell us you won't impose the death penalty. And if so, then there won't be an appeal hearing. Tell us that you believe he has some kind of rights to freedom of expression, and that'll be respected during the trial, and or that you would allow him to make a First Amendment challenge to the Espionage Act. I think a combination of those, and then of course everything will be okay. There will be no appeal hearing, and so the U.S. government can do this by like April 14th, and then there will be a hearing on May 20th about these assurances. And you may vaguely remember that we've had discussions about assurances before on Project Censored's radio show. And they related to how Julian Assange would be treated in prison or in detention while awaiting trial. And the US just made several empty pledges to the courts. They cannot be tested. There was no hearing about them, and then there would be a ruling issued about those. Judges said we have to take them under that they are good faith assurances. We cannot question how they are being put forward. And they ruled against Julian Assange after he had prevailed, after he had convinced a district judge to block extradition back in January 2021. So we're here again, and I don't expect anything less from the UK High Court. I expect that they will side with the US government and deny Julian Assange an appeal.
Yet, regardless of whatever representatives from the US government say, the actions do speak very clearly that they have a clear bias. You just mentioned reasons why he likely won't be getting a fair trial if he is extradited. I mean, I couldn't help but thinking of this when you were speaking, Kevin. I was reminded of the Rodney King case where they tried the police and they moved the trial from South Central LA to Simi Valley, which was basically a retirement community for police and judges and everyone else. And of course, the cops that beat King on camera were acquitted. Couldn't help but thinking of that. Nevertheless, moving back to Assange, what of the mention of tacking on? What of the mention of tacking on to the espionage cases, this collusion, or that he was somehow working with, I don't know, let's say Russia, right? Since that's always on the minds, especially of Democrats, that there's always some Russian bogeyman around every corner. And of course, there's been all kinds of efforts to connect Assange to the Trump campaign, to Russia. Could you quickly talk about some of those things again and remind our audience of some of the issues around those?
Yeah, I think that this is believable. I think everyone out there who hears discussion of this case probably can recognize that the US government, if it can get away with it, will go as far as they're willing to go in pursuing Julian Assange. And that's why it's believable to these judges, but they also know that this government, through the CIA and other parts of US intelligence, were focused on Julian Assange as a supposed national security threat. And so that's why it is believable that they would add this espionage charge or add an aiding and abetting treason charge. So since they're convinced by prosecutors that he is not a journalist, that is why they believe he could be exposed to these charges. So, if it was a conversation between press freedom advocates, we may find that it defies our understanding how a prosecutor could get to an espionage charge or an aiding and abetting treason charge. But it's not difficult if you believe that Julian Assange has performed some roles like an enemy of the state, because it's very easy to get there. And so that's why I need to very quickly work in what happened with the CIA part of this, because one of the key things that the Assange legal team wanted to do was to bring in this fresh evidence from a Yahoo News report that was based on over 30 unnamed officials. These were sources that spoke to them from the Trump administration or from U.S. intelligence agencies that had some knowledge about plans that were allegedly sketched by CIA Director Mike Pompeo and other high-ranking officials to go after and kidnap or poison or by other means kill Julian Assange while he was in Ecuador's London embassy. And I just have to read you. There's no reason for me to give you a paraphrase. I need to read what they wrote. The High Court put this in their decision. They said, on the face of the allegations, on the evidence before the judge and the fresh evidence, the contemplation of extreme measures against the applicant, and the applicant is Julian Assange, whether poisoning, for example, or rendition, were a response to the fear that the applicant might flee to Russia. The short answer to this is that the rationale for such conduct is removed if the applicant is extradited. Extradition would result in the applicant being lawfully in the custody of the United States authorities, and the reasons, if they can be called that, for rendition or kidnap or assassination then fall away. This was one of the most astonishing parts of the decision to me. It was not reported widely. I covered it in great detail, but I must emphasize this court is basically saying that Julian Assange's life is being saved from the CIA through this extradition. They are essentially saying it was an issue that the CIA might assassinate Julian Assange, but now that the US government is lawfully pursuing his extradition, there is no risk of CIA rendition anymore, so we need not take this any more seriously than we already have.
Welcome back to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today, in this segment, we are joined once again by independent reporter Kevin Gozstola of thedissenter.org. I urge listeners to please continue to check out Kevin's great reporting and great work on whistleblowers and, of course, on the ongoing case involving Julian Assange. Kevin's book that came out over a year ago is called Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange. Kevin, before the break, you were talking about and reminding our listeners of the CIA's role, and we've covered this, of course, at Project Censored. It was one of our top stories several years ago that, in fact, the CIA was plotting to assassinate him. Of course, they were also recording his behavior. They were recording his actions. They were recording everything he did when he was in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. He's been in the Belmarsh prison 5 years this week. And you and I have talked about this repeatedly. And before the break, you just gave the astonishing Orwellian justification for how extraditing Assange is the way of protecting him from the CIA's assassination, only to deliver him directly into hostile courts in the US, where he likely won't receive a fair hearing. And I want to point out that you and I have talked about this before, but I would be remiss not to mention it. There are even some press freedom groups that have dragged their feet around this issue. There are still people on the left repeating falsehoods about how Assange is a Putin puppet, or how he intervened in the Trump election. And we just touched on some of that moments ago. I still see tired tropes of the rape case that was dropped ages ago being brought up against him on the left. I mean, it's as if these people haven't been reading anything. And not that the newspapers are really good on this, but it's, again, people are not keeping up with the case, which is why we have you back on the program so often. For us at Project Censored, this case really is central to global press freedom. And it's important that we recognize these many distractions, including character assassinations against Assange, and to remind people that while Julian is a human being and a husband and a father, he's also a journalist, a publisher, and a representation, I think, pretty writ large in the 21st century of a classic muckraker who speaks truth to power and believes in journalism and the public interest, and that the public has a right to know the crimes its government commits and covers up. And Assange, of course, if he's guilty of something, it's surely guilty of embarrassing the U.S. government by exposing their wanton war crimes, while no one in the U.S. government has been held accountable for collateral murder. No one in the U.S. government has been held accountable for the heinous crimes exposed by Vault 7. The person leaking Vault 7 has been punished. Chelsea Manning was punished. And so I want to revisit the topic, Kevin, of why this isn't only about Julian Assange and what really is at stake in this case. Kevin Gozstola.
I think that what's at stake is whether the US government can target individuals in a way that deprives them of their right to freedom of expression. And I'll use that broadly because that's the way that it is understood globally. And freedom of expression includes speech. It includes engaging in journalism. And there are other activities that I believe would be connected to protest and dissent. And that's how international legal bodies or human rights groups approach these issues when they are looking at over 175 countries throughout the globe. And what I mean by this point is that the Justice Department is openly engaging in this action where they look at defendants who have engaged in journalism, and in order to excuse their decision to go forward with prosecuting those people, they just outright determine that that person is not a journalist. So we can't sit back and say that it doesn't matter if a person is a journalist or not. They perform the acts of journalism, and that's protected by the First Amendment. The very reason why the Justice Department is getting away with prosecuting Julian Assange is because they have chosen to label him as not a journalist, but someone more of like a hacker or an anarchist, or however they would view him internally. And they're doing this not just in Assange's case, they're doing this to a journalist named Timothy Burke in Florida, who was indicted less than 2 months ago because he was scouring the internet. We don't have time to get into his case on your broadcast, but I very quickly want to give a thumbnail summary. He was scouring the internet, according to them, which is what all journalists do. I basically sit around here scouring the internet every day to find articles. That's how bloggers have worked. They look all over the internet for something that's like a scoop that could get them traffic to their website or their YouTube channel.
Scouring is kind of a scare term for researching.
Yes. And
Scourers.
And so he was given access to some unencrypted feeds that included a Fox News stream, and he ended up being able to find the unedited version of Tucker Carlson's interview with Kanye West. And he was able to tell how they had edited that interview to make sure Kanye West didn't look as mentally ill as we know he is, and as anti-Semitic as he has been when he speaks openly. And he exposed to the world the way that Fox News had edited the interview to not only make Kanye look better, but I think Tucker Carlson look better. And then in response, Fox News and their lawyers got the Justice Department to send in the FBI, raid this man's home newsroom. They confiscated his computer equipment, and he's now facing a trial by the Economic Crimes Division of the Justice Department. And they say
Scouring the internet?
And they say he is not a journalist because he has not published under a byline in the last 2 years. So we need to recognize that whether it's the National Security Division or an Economic Crimes Division or some other part of the Justice Department, our government is doing this thing now, and so are local governments. We saw in Kansas, the Marion County Record, their 97, 98-year-old editor had her home raided, and it so traumatized her that she died the next day, even though she had been a perfectly healthy individual and probably could have lived to 100. And
it done nothing illegal.
Yeah, it had done nothing illegal. So we're seeing local governments and the Justice Department. So all the way down to the city level, we're seeing prosecutors decide that if they want to violate your rights, they will just send in the police or the FBI agents, and they will start a case, or they will start to pick apart your newsroom and your very life. And that's why people need to stand up for Julian Assange.
Kevin Gozstola, I was just going to punctuate that with you. And this is exactly why people who are concerned about freedom of the press need to care about the case against Julian Assange. They need to understand, as the title of your book points out, that he is being presumed guilty of journalism. And you just sketched it from top to bottom. So there are plenty of people, maybe on the sidelines in other government agencies and in local municipalities that might be attuned to this case, because it looks like if it happens to Assange, it's going to greenlight that kind of behavior all the way across the spectrum, right? I understand that some might say that's a slippery slope and we don't know that. I beg to differ. There are ample examples of how this has already been happening. You just mentioned a couple of the most egregious recent examples of it. And I think that this is something that people should seriously consider. If you're out there and you're still wondering why we're talking about the Julian Assange case, this is why. We care about freedom of the press. We care about the First Amendment. We care about the right of the public to know. Now, Kevin Gozstola, we only have a couple minutes left, and I wanted to segue briefly into some of the work. And we talked off air earlier. You had mentioned the work that you do with Rania Khalek. We're seeing again, great press failures in what's happening in the onslaught of by Israel in Gaza, and the killing of 30,000 people, over 130 journalists killed. It's unconscionable and it's extraordinary. It's finally recently the case that over half the U.S. public has grown to oppose Israeli actions in Gaza. And their murderous rampage in Gaza. Could you connect this for our listeners in terms of the Assange case, in terms of the kinds of atrocities that are being committed and why it's so essential that journalists are protected, and also that people understand that we need solidarity in order to work together to speak up to stop the brutality that's being met upon the Palestinian public?
Yeah, definitely. I think for those in tune with press freedom, obviously the thing that we hear most from the Biden White House now is that we need to free Evan Gershkovich from a prison that Vladimir Putin has put him into. But I think just as essential is to look at the more than 100 journalists in Gaza that have been killed. Also, they're banning Al Jazeera in Israel. They're going to take all these news networks off of having the access to this information. And Al Jazeera is one of the only news media organizations that have been on the ground in Gaza reporting on what's happening. But you connect these two. You look at what's happening with Assange and you look at Gaza, and in my head, often people are baffled at the way that Julian Assange is being treated. And I think for those people who have seen what's happening with Israel's assault on Gaza and the way the United States government has been willing to just allow it to unfold, Joe Biden isn't doing anything to stop it. You go, oh, well, the slow death of a journalist is possible if you're okay with greenlighting this violence that has been happening, this assault that has been relentless for the last 6 months. And I just want to close here on your show by shouting out a few of the people who have supported my work and given me a platform and have also had me on as a kind of reporter to share this news, not just Project Censored. You've had these regular updates, but I need to give credit to Scott Horton and his anti-war radio show, because every time there's a development, I'm invited on his program. I've been invited on a colleague of mine show. Jordan Cheriton has this show called Status Coup. He's known for his work on the Flint water crisis and the criminality around it, but he regularly invites me on. And then Breakthrough News, hosted by Rania Khalek and Eugene Puryear. I'm regularly invited to act as a reporter and update people on Assange. And those places, those platforms, those outlets, those channels, they're far and few, but I think your listeners might be interested in supporting them or paying attention to them if they're looking for good news, not junk news.
Absolutely, Kevin Gozstola. And of course, it's my strong belief that you should have been on Amy Goodman's show, Democracy Now! Teen times by now, given your expertise and coverage of this, but you've seemingly had no such luck there. I would also like to say to anybody else out there listening, Kevin is an extraordinary reporter and author. He is an expert on this case, and I strongly encourage your presence on as many platforms and as many outlets as would give you the opportunity to speak about these important issues. Kevin Gozstola, thank you so much for once again taking time out to update us on the Julian Assange case. Kevin Gozstola is author of Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange. book is a little bit over a year old now. It received great praise from Daniel Ellsberg, Noam Chomsky, with a foreword by Abby Martin. To follow Kevin's work, you can go to thedissenter.org. Kevin Gozstola, thank you so much for joining us again on the Project Censored Show today.